Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely chilling physical metaphor, a top-secret forest complex known as the Wolf's Lair. This place perfectly mirrored a dictator's descent from absolute hubris into total ruin. It's a really fascinating look at how architecture and isolation can actually reflect a deteriorating mind. And we're going to break the whole thing down. I mean, just think about these numbers for a second. Over the course of 800 days, this sprawling, heavily fortified command center tucked away in the East Prussian woods became the very epicenter for the catastrophic unraveling of the Eastern Front during the Second World War. It started out as this massive symbol of conquest, but as we'll see, it totally transformed into an absolute isolation chamber. Section 1. Building the Wolf's Lair.
So, timing is everything, right? Hitler actually arrived at this newly built complex on June 24, 1941, literally just 2 days after launching Operation Barbarossa. His goal was to direct the largest invasion force in human history from a location that felt right up close to the new front line. Initially, the mood there was incredibly jubilant, and the German army honestly seemed completely unstoppable.
And the sheer scale of this project? Absolutely monumental, costing 36 million Reichsmarks, which translates to hundreds of millions in today's money. This was a massive, massive undertaking. It was built by thousands of workers, including forced laborers, who were out there laboring in the freezing, brutal winter of 1940. We're talking about pouring concrete and laying bricks in temperatures that regularly drop to -5 degrees and below. Now, originally, this place was pitched as a sort of humble frontline camp for the cameras. But the reality? It was an impenetrable fortress of concealment, a 10-kilometer outer fence, a 200-meter minefield, and 3 entirely distinct security zones. It was quite literally a concealment within a concealment, complete with massive camouflage nets that completely blocked out the sky just to hide it from Allied bombers. Which brings us to Section 2, a brutal disconnect. You know, the momentum of the war shifted incredibly fast. We go from that wildly successful advance in the summer of 1941 to grinding to an absolute halt outside Moscow by December. By the time we hit the winter of 1942 and early 1943, the entire situation devolves into the catastrophic Soviet encirclement of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad. This was the turning point from which the Third Reich would never recover.
To really grasp how completely unprepared the leadership was for a brutal Russian winter, look at propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. He actually had to go on the radio in December of 1941 and beg everyday civilians to send their woolen thermal underwear to the troops. It just perfectly captures how blindly they rushed into this invasion without any real preparation for a prolonged winter war.
The disconnect here is just mind-boggling. On one hand, you've got soldiers at Stalingrad fighting hand-to-hand in sewers, eating rats, and freezing in -40-degree temperatures. Meanwhile, Hitler was completely divorced from reality. He's waking up at 11 a.m., reading the newspaper in a warm bed, and subjecting his staff to these long, rambling afternoon lunches where he'd just tell the exact same stories from the First World War over and over.
And that delusion bled right into the military strategy. When the army was trapped at Stalingrad, they needed a minimum of 500 tons of supplies a day just to survive. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, confidently promised to supply them by air. But get this, he only promised 350 tons. He was guaranteeing failure from the very start. And even then, he couldn't actually deliver that, cementing a catastrophic loss.
Moving into Section 3, paranoia and yes men. So, unable to handle any sort of pushback, Hitler basically banished any experienced general who dared to disagree with him. Instead, he surrounded himself entirely with enablers. Men like Wilhelm Keitel, who the other generals literally nicknamed lackey behind his back, and Alfred Jodl, who just blindly enacted disastrous orders. This toxic echo chamber led directly to massive avoidable failures like the 1943 Kursk tank offensive. They launched it purely for propaganda, straight into a situation where German forces were outnumbered 10-1 by Soviet T-34 tanks. And physically, the isolation was just destroying him. People who saw him noted that 3 years of war had aged the man 15 years. He developed this terrible stooping posture, his skin turned gray, and his limbs were constantly shaking. He became heavily reliant on his doctor, Theodor Morell, who was injecting him every single day with a completely bizarre cocktail of drugs just to keep him functioning. He was paranoid, heavily medicated, and utterly cut off from the outside world.
And it's absolutely crucial to remember that it was inside this very echo chamber of yes men that the darkest horrors of the war were organized. SS head Heinrich Himmler visited the Wolf's Lair constantly, averaging about 1.6 times a month, for top-secret, heavily guarded meetings with Hitler. It was in these isolated, secure little rooms that the horrific details of the final solution were likely coordinated, far, far removed from the eyes of the public.
Section 4. The July 20 Plot. Now, this part is fascinating. The sheer, chaotic luck that saved the dictator's life during Operation Valkyrie was driven by the absolute finest of margins. A young officer named Klaus von Stauffenberg managed to sneak a briefcase bomb right into a briefing. But think about the factors at play here. The summer heat was so bad they had to move the meeting out of a pressurized concrete bunker and into a wooden hut. Stauffenberg, who was actually missing fingers from combat, only had time to arm one of his 2 bombs. And right before it went off, another officer just casually moved the explosive briefcase behind a massive solid oak table leg.
So, right at 12:42 p.m., the bomb detonates. The force is massive. 4 people are killed instantly, and the room is reduced to absolute rubble. But Hitler miraculously survives with only minor injuries, largely saved by those wooden walls that let the blast dissipate outward, and of course, that heavy table leg. In a completely bizarre twist of fate, Mussolini arrived for a visit that exact same day, and Hitler eagerly showed him the wreckage. The aftermath, though, was swift and brutal. A deadly witch hunt was launched across Germany, which permanently broke the independence of the army.
And that leads us to our last section. Section 5. The Final Collapse. After the bombing, Hitler retreated even deeper into his literal and psychological isolation chamber. His personal bunker underwent a massive, desperate upgrade in late 1944. An astonishing 17,000 cubic feet of concrete was poured to reinforce it, creating impenetrable walls 36 feet tall. He essentially sealed himself inside a giant concrete tomb, while the Soviet army just kept marching closer and closer. But here's the ultimate irony. This massive, supposedly impenetrable architectural marvel, it achieved absolutely nothing. By November 1944, Hitler fled, and by January 1945, the Germans were actually forced to pack their own fortress with explosives and blow it apart from the inside just to stop the advancing Red Army from capturing it. It's an incredible reminder that no amount of physical fortification can ever save a fundamentally broken strategy. As we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a really provocative question to think about. How does a fortress built to command absolute power become the perfect ruined monument to ultimate delusion? You know, the Wolf's Lairs started out as a launchpad for a global empire, but as the leader's mind deteriorated into paranoia and yes men, the architecture just followed suit, becoming a claustrophobic concrete shell. Today, its blown-out ruins in the East Prussian forest stand as the ultimate monument to hubris and delusion. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and I hope this journey gave you a clear understanding of this incredibly dark, fascinating piece of history. See you next time.